At Sunday brunch, they raised their glasses to new beginnings, right after announcing Grandma's inheritance would pay off my sister's $140,000 debt. My uncle smirked. "You never really needed your share." I just sipped my coffee and checked my phone. The trust I'd quietly opened 11 weeks ago had just finalized, and the money wasn't where they thought it was. I, 29M, had always been the family's designated problem solver. When my sister racked up her MBA debt, when my uncle's restaurant needed a bailout, when my cousin's wedding required funding, somehow, everyone knew I'd figure it out. What they didn't know was that I'd been planning my exit strategy for months. The text from my lawyer came through just as my uncle was pouring champagne. 11 weeks of careful legal maneuvering had finally paid off. While my family celebrated what they thought was their financial salvation, I sat there knowing the money they were counting on had been legally redirected into an irrevocable trust that morning. Grandma had died 6 months earlier, leaving behind her estate worth nearly $2 million. She'd always favored me. I was the one who visited weekly, handled her medications, drove her to appointments while everyone else was too busy. Her will named me as executor, which my family assumed was just a formality. They figured the money would be divided equally among her 4 grandchildren, with the largest share going to cover my sister's crushing debt from her failed startup venture. My sister had been living beyond her means for years. The $140,000 debt was just the tip of the iceberg. She owed money to credit cards, personal loans, and had even borrowed against her car. Meanwhile, my uncle had been making snide comments about how I didn't need money since I lived modestly and worked in tech. He'd joked that I was too antisocial to spend money anyway, so why shouldn't it go to people who actually needed it? The Sunday brunch had been my mother's idea. She wanted the whole family together when they announced their plan for Grandma's inheritance. I watched my sister fidget with her phone, probably checking her mounting interest charges. My uncle kept glancing at his watch. His restaurant was hemorrhaging money, and he needed cash fast. My cousin sat quietly, but I knew she was hoping for enough to put a down payment on a house. My mother stood up and tapped her glass with a knife. She explained how they'd all discussed it and decided the most responsible thing would be to use the bulk of Grandma's money to clear my sister's debt. After all, she reasoned, education debt was an investment in the family's future. The rest would be split among various family needs: my uncle's business expenses, my cousin's housing fund, and a small emergency reserve. My uncle raised his glass and made that comment about me not really needing my share. Everyone laughed and nodded along. I'd always been the responsible one, the one who didn't ask for anything, so clearly I didn't need anything. They'd calculated that after taxes and their planned distributions, I'd receive maybe $50,000 from an estate I'd spent 2 years helping to organize and preserve. I just sipped my coffee and let them talk. They had no idea that I'd spent the previous 11 weeks working with estate attorneys to establish something called a charitable remainder trust. As executor, I had broad discretionary powers over the estate's assets, and I'd used every legal tool available to protect what was rightfully mine. The process had been complex but straightforward. I'd identified several legitimate charitable organizations that aligned with causes Grandma had supported during her lifetime. The trust would provide me with annual payments for the next 20 years, while the remainder would eventually go to charity. The beauty of it was that once the assets were transferred into the trust, they were legally protected from creditors and couldn't be easily accessed by other family members. My phone buzzed again. The final paperwork had been filed, and the trust was officially funded. Nearly $1.8 million had been legally transferred beyond their reach. They were celebrating their financial solution while the money they were counting on had already vanished into a structure designed to benefit me and eventually worthy causes. I waited until they finished their toasts before excusing myself to the bathroom. Once alone, I called my lawyer to confirm everything was finalized. She assured me the trust was bulletproof and that my family's planned rate on the estate was now impossible. The money was mine to receive in annual installments, and there was nothing they could legally do to change that. When I returned to the table, my sister was already making plans. She talked about finally being debt-free, maybe starting another business venture. My uncle was calculating how much he could invest back into his restaurant. My mother was proud of how they'd all worked together to solve everyone's problems. I let them enjoy their moment of triumph. There would be time later to explain the legal realities. For now, I wanted to savor watching them celebrate a victory they'd never achieve. The irony wasn't lost on me. They'd spent years treating me like I was somehow less deserving of financial security because I managed my money responsibly. They assumed my modest lifestyle meant I didn't need or want anything, while they lived beyond their means and expected family resources to bail them out of their poor decisions. My sister's debt hadn't accumulated overnight. She'd made risky business decisions, ignored financial advice, and consistently chose short-term gratification over long-term stability. My uncle had expanded his restaurant too quickly, hired too many employees, and refused to adjust his business model when the market changed. They'd created their own problems and now expected inheritance money to solve them. But I'd been quietly building my own financial stability for years. I'd invested wisely, lived below my means, and saved consistently. I didn't need the inheritance to survive, but I'd earned it through 2 years of managing Grandma's care and affairs while everyone else was conveniently unavailable. The trust I'd established would provide me with approximately $120,000 annually for the next 20 years. That was real financial security, steady income that would supplement my career earnings and provide genuine independence. After 20 years, the remaining principal would go to charities that Grandma had supported, honoring her memory in a way that actually reflected her values. I finished my coffee and listened to them make increasingly elaborate plans. My sister was already looking at apartments in expensive neighborhoods. My uncle was talking about hiring a new chef and expanding his catering services. They were spending money that no longer existed. Update 1. The phone call came 3 days later. My mother had contacted the estate attorney to begin the distribution process, only to discover that the assets were no longer available for their planned allocation. She demanded an explanation, and I agreed to meet with the entire family that evening. I arrived at my parents' house to find everyone assembled in the living room. The mood was significantly different from Sunday's celebration. My sister looked panicked. She'd apparently already contacted some of her creditors to negotiate payment plans based on the expected inheritance. My uncle seemed confused and angry. My cousin appeared worried about her housing plans. My mother asked me directly what had happened to the money. I explained calmly that as executor, I'd established a charitable remainder trust to protect the estate's assets and honor Grandma's philanthropic interests. The money was legally secured and would be distributed according to the trust's terms, not their informal family agreement. My sister immediately accused me of stealing her financial salvation. She'd been counting on that money to restart her life and now felt betrayed. My uncle was more direct. He called me selfish and accused me of manipulating legal technicalities to cheat the family out of their fair shares. I let them vent their frustrations before responding. I reminded them that they'd never actually consulted me about their distribution plan. They'd simply assumed I would go along with their decision to use the majority of the inheritance to solve my sister's financial problems. They'd made plans for money that legally belonged to the estate, not to them individually. My mother tried to appeal to family loyalty. She argued that helping my sister was the right thing to do and that I was being unnecessarily harsh. I countered that enabling my sister's financial irresponsibility wasn't actually helping her learn to manage money properly. Giving her $140,000 to clear her current debts wouldn't address the spending habits and poor decision-making that created those debts in the first place. The conversation grew heated. My uncle threatened legal action, claiming I'd violated my duties as executor. I calmly informed him that I'd worked with qualified estate attorneys throughout the process and that every action taken was within my legal authority. The trust was designed to benefit both myself and charitable causes that Grandma had supported. It actually honored her wishes better than their plan to bail out my sister's business failures. My sister broke down crying, saying I destroyed her future. I felt a moment of sympathy, but then remembered all the times she'd made dismissive comments about my careful financial planning. She'd often joked that I was too boring to enjoy money and that I should be more spontaneous with my spending. Now she wanted that same careful financial management to solve problems created by her spontaneous spending. I stood up to leave, but my cousin asked a crucial question. She wanted to know if there was any legal way to challenge what I'd done. I explained that charitable remainder trusts are specifically designed to be irrevocable once established. The money was permanently committed to the trust's terms, and no amount of family pressure could change that legal reality. As I walked to my car, I could hear them arguing among themselves. They were trying to figure out alternative solutions to their financial problems, solutions that didn't involve inheritance money they'd never legally been entitled to receive. Update 2. 2 weeks passed before I heard from anyone. My sister called, her voice much calmer than during our confrontational family meeting. She said she'd been thinking about what I'd said regarding her spending habits and wanted to understand my perspective better. We met for coffee, and she admitted that she'd been living in denial about her financial situation. The inheritance had seemed like a magical solution that would let her avoid dealing with the root causes of her debt problems. Without that safety net, she'd been forced to confront some uncomfortable truths about her relationship with money. She'd contacted a financial counselor and was developing a realistic debt repayment plan. It would take years instead of months, but she was finally addressing her spending patterns rather than just trying to eliminate the symptoms. She even apologized for some of the harsh things she'd said during our family meeting. I appreciated her honesty and offered to help her review her budget and debt consolidation options. I made it clear that I wouldn't be providing direct financial assistance, but I was willing to share the financial planning knowledge I developed over the years. She accepted, seeming to understand that learning to manage money properly was more valuable than receiving a one-time bailout. My uncle, however, took a different approach. He'd consulted with his own lawyer about challenging the trust, but discovered that I'd been thorough in following proper legal procedures. Instead of accepting this reality, he'd begun spreading stories within our extended family about how I'd stolen money that was meant to help everyone. Some relatives believed his version of events and stopped speaking to me. Others understood that inheritance money isn't automatically community property and that I'd acted within my rights as executor. The family was effectively split between those who supported my decision and those who felt I'd betrayed family values. My mother tried to mediate, suggesting that I could still choose to distribute some of the trust income to family members in need. I explained that the trust terms didn't allow for discretionary distributions to individuals. The annual payments were designated for my benefit alone, with the remainder eventually going to charity. The restaurant my uncle owned was struggling worse than he'd admitted. Without the inheritance money he'd been counting on, he was facing the possibility of closure within 6 months. Part of me felt sorry for him, but I also remembered all the times he'd made jokes about my frugal lifestyle and suggested I didn't need money because I didn't know how to enjoy it. I'd offered business advice in the past, suggestions about cost control, menu optimization, and market positioning, but he dismissed my input because I didn't have restaurant experience. Now he wanted me to provide financial resources while continuing to ignore operational advice that might actually save his business. My cousin had found a more realistic apartment and was adjusting her expectations about homeownership. She seemed disappointed but not bitter, understanding that inheritance money was never guaranteed. Her practical approach to the situation reminded me of my own financial philosophy. Work with what you have rather than counting on what you hope to receive. The trust was performing well. My financial advisor had invested the principal conservatively, focusing on steady income generation rather than high-risk growth. The annual distributions would provide substantial financial security while preserving the principal for eventual charitable benefit. I'd selected the charitable beneficiaries carefully, choosing organizations that Grandma had actually supported during her lifetime. She'd regularly donated to a local food bank, a literacy program, and an organization that provided medical care to underserved communities. The trust would eventually provide significant funding to continue work she'd believed in. Update 3. 6 months later, the family dynamics had settled into a new normal. My sister was making steady progress on her debt repayment plan and had started a small side business that was actually profitable. She'd learned to live within her means and seemed genuinely happier with her more modest but sustainable lifestyle. My uncle's restaurant had closed, but he'd found work as a chef at an established restaurant downtown. The transition had been difficult, but he was earning steady income without the stress of business ownership. He still wasn't speaking to me, but through family gossip I heard he was doing well in his new position. The trust continued to perform as expected. My first annual distribution had been deposited, and I'd used part of it to make some home improvements I'd been postponing. The rest went into my investment portfolio, continuing the pattern of financial responsibility that had originally annoyed my family. Some relatives remained convinced I'd acted selfishly, but others had come to understand my perspective. Grandma had specifically chosen me as executor because she trusted my judgment and financial management skills. Using those skills to create long-term financial security while honoring her charitable interests was exactly what she'd expected from me. The charitable remainder trust had been a complex solution to a simple problem, protecting inheritance assets from family members who felt entitled to money they'd never legally been promised. It provided me with financial security while ensuring that Grandma's charitable values would eventually benefit the community causes she'd cared about. I occasionally wondered if I'd been too harsh in my approach. Perhaps I could have found a middle ground that helped my sister while still protecting my own interests. But then I remembered all the years of being treated like my financial responsibilities somehow made me less deserving of financial resources. My family had assumed that because I didn't flaunt wealth or make expensive purchases, I didn't need or want money. They'd mistaken careful financial management for indifference to financial security. They'd been wrong, and their assumptions had cost them access to inheritance money they'd never actually been entitled to receive. The trust would continue providing annual distributions for the next 19 years. That was nearly 2 decades of financial security that would allow me to take career risks, support causes I believed in, and build wealth for my own future family. After 20 years, the remaining principal would fund charitable work that honored Grandma's memory appropriately. At family gatherings, there was still tension. Some people remained angry about my decisions, while others had accepted the new reality. I'd learned to ignore the disapproving looks and whispered comments. I'd acted legally and ethically to protect assets that were legally mine to protect. The inheritance situation had revealed something important about family dynamics. When money was involved, people's true priorities became clear. Some family members valued financial gain over relationships, while others understood that inheritance is a privilege, not an entitlement. I'd chosen financial security and charitable giving over family popularity. Time would tell whether that had been the right decision, but I was comfortable with the choice I'd made. The trust was providing exactly the financial foundation I'd hoped to create, and Grandma's money would eventually benefit causes she'd cared about rather than enabling poor financial decisions. The Sunday brunch where they'd celebrated their planned distribution seemed like years ago now. They'd raised their glasses to new beginnings that never materialized, while I'd quietly secured the financial future I'd worked years to build. Sometimes the best revenge is simply succeeding when others expect you to fail.